A pleasure to meet all at last, and here we are once again with films I should have talked about years ago. Now this is something I feel like I could have talked about a while ago, so I'm more than happy to present a Stanley Kubrick film. But not just any Stanley Kubrick film, no man, this goes even further back than the likes of most others that we've talked about. Yeah, 1987, he was pretty much at the height of his success with a number of different movies he made over the years, but his peak would have probably come around Full Metal Jacket. Yes, so this is probably what most people consider to be the best of his work so far, because it wasn't just a movie centered on certain things correlating to war, but it also gave us an inside experience as to what boot camp would have been like. Knowing that for at least 9 weeks on end, a large platoon of people are basically born anew, christened with certain new names, and of course brought into the world as muscular-bound soldiers ready to fight. Well, in this case though, many people do think of this as being a bit more on the accurate side of things, as while most fictional films do tend to drive pretty much far away from realism to make it more on the believable side, in the same regard as to how some films centered on adaptation are meant to get away from source material in order to become more believable, this one does defy a lot of expectations. And more often than not, it goes straight on for a number of different things. This is a film about satire for the most part. And while war itself is known to be in a lot of different movies, not just with Full Metal Jacket, but there were a good amount of others out there. Prior to Full Metal Jacket's release, there was of course a film that came out 1 year before known as simply as Platoon. And that of course was famous for having the likes of Forrest Whitaker as well as Willem Dafoe. But even further back, there were also other films, like Patton, the famous 1970 film about General Patton. But in any other case though, what Full Metal Jacket has to offer, while it is a bit more on the fictional side as opposed to telling more of a realistic tale to it, it still does center on a well-known real-life warfare. Vietnam. Yeah, so even right up to the opening scene in which it was, believe it or not, the last scene that they shot where everybody's getting buzz cutted in the barbershop. Yeah, seriously. This was the last shot that they made, but this is just only a taste of what Kubrick's genius played out to, as to how this film got into such a big success and was probably the best of all of his films to date. No, because what happens is that after the intro's done, where everybody's getting buzz cut, it's set to Hello Vietnam, you know? It was a popular song that was made pretty much during the height of the war. But what it does is that almost immediately afterwards, it gets us to the platoon. Basically, a large network of bunk beds, and of course, the drill sergeant, the senior drill instructor known as Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. He was played by the one and only R. Lee Ermey, whom, fun fact, prior to Full Metal Jacket, he was basically a teenager in the early 1960s, and had been arrested for a few different crimes that he caused. He was ultimately given an ultimatum: either serve some time in prison for what he did, or join the military, since the early 1960s happened to be a point where a lot of delinquents would end up in the military, or other forms of government work, supposedly as a means of rehabilitation. But everybody knows, here in the slobbering 20s, 60 years later, the best way to cure insanity is to let it run its course. So, you just can't really get around that fact. But back then, not many people knew much better. Either way you look at it though, R. Lee Ermey did serve his time with the Marine Corps, and he actually did a pretty good job. On top of all that, he actually would receive a promotion where he would become a sergeant. And this is actually what led to him with his outstanding performances as Hartman himself. You see, right from the get-go, this is a man whom has all the poses arranged, all the dialogue put together, and the unique, nasty attitude that a drill instructor will indeed give out to all of his members of the platoon. Fresh, new recruits are pretty much unwelcome, with a certain glaring insights that he of course gives to every one of these new platoon members. Right down to a man whom was of course black-skinned. He of course was given the name Private Snowball. Yeah, so that's just, again, like I said, this is the tip of the iceberg as to what truly made this Stanley Kubrick film one of a kind. And probably something you could never ever make anymore. It's not just the fact that it's racially bigot towards a number of people, not just with Private Snowball, but there's a few other members like him as well. And even Hartman himself once said that he would not look down on these kind of people. But we all know what he says, right? He calls them the N-word. Just flat out, and without any hesitation either. But he also does refer to a number of other stereotypical terms relating to certain peoples, like wops and greasers. Oof. Like, I'm getting some major vibes coming from the likes of various other media out there. But that's for another time, though. Either way you look at it, though, it's not just about Private Snowball, but it's about others as well. Another person ends up talking about John Wayne. Hartman gets into a bit of a rant, ends up choking somebody for it until the other guy confesses, and it turns out that it's basically another man, whom of course is pretty essential to the plot as well. Matthew Modine, whom of course is James T. Joker. Yeah, Joker is the nickname that he's given by Hartman for essentially playing up some sort of funny gag. Yeah. But he, of course, wasn't really laughing about it. In fact, he goes straight for the gut punch. Yeah. This is, of course, one of his many lessons that he will offer to all of his platoon members. And as for the other guy whom he had strangled earlier, he, of course, goes up to him and refers to him as Private Cowboy because he comes from Texas, where steers and queers come from. Yeah. Like I said, R. Lee Ermey was just not at all afraid to do anything. A role like this truly did require a ton of bigoted slurs and all sorts of horrifying language to come out of his mouth. Because, in the grand scheme of all things, the drill instructor will do everything that it takes to get his men up and running, out there on the course, out there on the drills, and of course into their bunks, in which they'll be asleep until probably 3 o'clock in the morning, where they are rudely awakening by a loud sound and their rifles are all drawn and ready to go, and they of course have to engage in a so-called 2-minute long shower and dress up routine. Now, I don't exactly know if that's really what happened back in the day, or even today, if this still happens to be true. But either way, Full Metal Jacket's plot sure does make you feel like they actually are participating in the Marine Corps. And more importantly, because of Hartman's real-life experiences with the military, this of course truly does kick in the realism to an even bigger degree that nobody would have ever been able to do. There's a lot of other films pertaining to military. Platoon, Platten, like I've said before, but there were many others that would come out after Full Metal Jacket, like Forrest Gump, We Were Soldiers, and Major Payne. But none of them had owned up to the unique nature of Sergeant Hartman, because everybody knows the prior experience that he had in the military gave Ermey much more of a likelihood to truly be as real of a drill instructor by fictional film standards as possible. Anyways, though, many other events would unfold throughout the days in the platoon. You not only had the introduction of a majority of the important characters, Snowball, Cowboy, Joker, and even the likes of Gomer Pyle. Yeah, basically an Andy Griffith reference. And character nonetheless. While he wasn't as big of a character in the cast, he sure had a number of recurring roles over the years. And the name, of course, was given to a man known as Leonard Lawrence, who was large and oversized. And he was, of course, believe it or not, played by a person who was relatively thin, known as Vince D'Onofrio. Vincent D'Onofrio, though, one other piece of trivia that's important to note that is that Kubrick wanted him to be over 70 pounds heavier than he originally was when he was cast. Yeah, so I guess the idea of him having to gain 70 pounds just to play the role was to get called out a fatso by Sergeant Hartman. That really takes a lot of guts. Imagine if I had to become like anorexic just to be called a pile of bones or something like that. Well, I don't see that happening by any means. I sure as hell am a lot thinner than I was years ago, but I am certainly not going to let myself go down to an anorexic size. You know, where my rib cage is visible. No way, man. Not like that. Anyways, though, there's lots of other things that unfold. There's the exercises military condenses, including songs that they sing. I don't know what I've been told, Eskimo. Yeah, you probably get the gist of it all. It's a lot of the typical action that's put into place when it comes to boot camp training, often narrated by the likes of Matthew Modine himself. Yeah, so Private Joker is essentially seen as the main protagonist of the film entirely. Some people might think of Hartman as the antagonist because it is true, he's hard on those guys, but he himself does state that he is fair, probably more so than most other people out there. And it is in fact true. There's a lot of people who will treat us like crap, but they do a lot better than most others. You know? That's probably an important lesson that I feel like most people overlook, is that it doesn't matter, like, let's say if your parents were pretty horrible to you over the years, they still love you in some sort of contentful way. That might be saying a lot, though, so I guess I'll just move on before it gets weird. But in any other case, though, probably the biggest thing that's worth noting here is the continuous failures of Leonard Gomer Pyle Lawrence. Yeah, Private Pyle is the guy who constantly messes things up. He doesn't do that well in most of the exercises and drills, and he sometimes is a bit afraid of heights, as we see in one particular notion. But the real big problem shows up when a jelly donut is found in his footlocker, because while Hartman was counting toes, if you will, he happens to find the lock on Private Pyle's footlocker out, meaning that it's unlocked, meaning that he, of course, does not approve. After trashing the locker, he finds the donut inside and starts questioning Pyle for it. Pyle, of course, tells him that the real reason why the donut was there is because he was hungry. That's pretty much it. This, of course, does create the biggest turning point for everybody in the platoon, because one general rule that is at least accurately shown here is that if one person in the platoon screws up, the entire rest of the company has to suffer for it. Yeah, I've seen actual videos about certain other military organizations, not just the Marine Corps, but also the Coast Guard. I will say the Coast Guard does follow this exact rule to the whim. Because one video that I saw where in the classroom, one of the platoon members ended up sticking his middle finger out at the cameraman, and he himself was immediately reprimanded for his actions. But we do get to see there is another scene that takes place afterwards, where everybody is escorted out of the classroom and back to their bunkhouse. This, of course, is where the drill instructor has them wrap their hands around a water bottle over their head like this and repeat the words, "We have no self-discipline," usually at the top of their lungs. And let me tell you, much like what happened there, the Marine Corps is forced to do a bunch of push-ups while Pyle eats his jelly donut in front of him. So, it's basically a little tactic that Hartman put together for them. So, when you really think about it, there's no telling who is going to be the one that screws up. Well, it's Pyle most of the time. And this is not the first time that it would happen either. It would happen several times. One day, however, everybody would engage in a little something known as a soap swash. This is basically where a bar of soap is put into their sock, and they basically use it sort of like a makeshift whip. Or I guess like a medieval mace. But instead of spiked tips on a ball on a stick, it's basically like a brick inside of a sock, basically. Because that's what it is. A soap is pretty much in the shape of a brick. most of the time. And what happens here is that Pyle is restrained by the likes of both Cowboy and Joker, while everybody else in the platoon ends up whacking Pyle's body with their whappers. And somebody actually said that the experience really hurts because compared to other methods of torture that would be used for stabbing or bruising somebody, a bar of soap being whacked against someone's chest or stomach ends up creating a bit of a dimple in their body, probably akin to that of a small dip or crater. And what happens is that the pain is actually much more intense than many other forms of torture like that. Because he is getting hit by a blunt object, but typically the corners will hit him really hard. While it's not exactly sharp enough to cause a perforation, it sure is a pretty horrifying feeling. Probably more so than most other forms of blunt object trauma. So, of course, while most of this stuff does carry on though, Pyle is made to believe like it was a dream, as Cowboy himself orders him to do so. But we do get to see a target practice in which that Hartman actually does see some potential for Private Pyle. He might suck in a lot of ways, but he seems to be a really good shooter with his rifle. And you could say Pyle was more than thrilled for that. So thrilled that on another night, Joker happens to hear Pyle in the restroom. And he goes to find him with his rifle in hand. And eventually, Pyle starts messing around, repeating his rifleman's prayer like we saw in an earlier scene of the film, where everybody was saying the rifleman's prayer. And Hartman was not at all happy about this. He got up in the middle of the night, checked on the two, and started yelling at Joker for not being responsible enough to get Pyle back to bed. Of course, Pyle himself is not willing to go down without a fight. So his fully loaded Full Metal Jacket magazine rifle is all ready to roll. In other words, one shot to the chest kills Hartman. And later, Pyle himself feels so distraught by this sudden move. It practically comes out of nowhere, too. But to be fair, Hartman was pretty harsh on Pyle. So you could say it psychopathically forced him to do the unthinkable. And what happened? He shoots himself, too. So you can imagine that Joker must be feeling pretty bad for him. Yeah. Now, while this is pretty much the part of the film that most people will remember, the rest of the film does center on the war itself, Nam. Basically, the entirety of the platoon, with the exception of a few people, do graduate from their platoon and move on to service in Vietnam. A good majority of the film is spent with most of the characters, like Cowboy and Joker, all going around the war zone and doing what they do best. But of course, acknowledging the many lessons they have here and there. So you could say that while a majority of the film was centered on the platoon, where most of the big action takes place, the somewhat lesser known second act of the film that takes place in the actual war, while it's not exactly seen as much of a big war-related sort of commodity, it still does chalk up to the idea that Kubrick himself was more than willing to put more effort into the likes of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman and the rest of the platoon rather than just focus on the entirety of the war. Because you see, the idea of Full Metal Jacket was mostly for the idea of what the recruits would do long before they enter any sort of conflict. And in that sense, that's what makes this more than just a classic. This is something that is culturally significant nearly 40 years later. And with that in mind, I go on ahead and give this film a good 8.5 out of 10.1. It definitely is Kubrick's masterpiece. The one thing that truly made him the director that he was. Because 13 years later, well, he unfortunately would die in 1998. So, just think about it. It only been around 10, 11 years since the release of Full Metal Jacket. But by the turn of the new millennium, you can really think about it firsthand that a big-time director with a number of films under his belt, he unfortunately is not around to do any more filmmaking. But we still do have a good number of others. James Cameron, Michael Bay, M. Night Shyamalan, and pretty much a lot of others down the line as well. So I feel like that's enough spoken of one particular piece from the 80s. So I will move on to something else. But until then, thank you guys for watching. And make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.